You are listening to a podcast of Warwick University's K2 Research Centre, produced together with On Humans. I'm your host, Ilari Mäkelä. And today we continue the 5-episode series trying to understand one of history's most impactful events, the so-called Great Divergence, the rise of Western Europe and later the US as the richest corners of the modern world. And in the opening episode we heard from historian Kenneth Pomerantz, who explained the rise of the West by focusing on colonialism and on fossil fuels. But what about science? The rise of Europe happens during and after the scientific revolution, and as today's guest points out, it's probably not a coincidence. My guest today is Northwestern University's economic historian Joel Mokyr, a recipient of the 2025 Nobel Prize in Economics. For decades now, Mokyr has been asking economists to take culture and ideas more seriously. Intellectual history is not separate from economic history, and the transformation of first Europe and later the world cannot be understood without understanding the rise of a new kind of culture in first Europe and later the whole world. Or so Mokyr thinks. But how much did science actually help the Industrial Revolution? And how much praise do Enlightenment thinkers really deserve, given their entanglements in slavery and colonialism? I'll let Joel Mokyr give you his answers. I hope that you enjoy this. If you do, you can also find plenty more material, including an essay that summarizes this conversation, at our series page. Link to it is in the show notes. And do subscribe to the podcast to get all of our upcoming episodes too, where amongst other things we turn the angle from Europe to China, Japan and India, tracing the path to the modern world with as much balance and breadth as we can. But now let's begin with Joel Mokyr. Professor Joel Mokyr, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Hilary. Delighted to be here.
What is the Great Divergence and how did you get interested in the topic?
Everybody's interested in this topic, you know. It's one of those things about which the great economist Bob Lucas once said that once you start thinking about it, it's hard to think about anything else. Because this is, of course, the planet on which we all live. And we all know that in this planet, there are some parts that have become very rich and some parts that have not become very rich. And that basically is what the Great Divergence is all about. Now, I should add maybe, which is kind of something that hasn't been made very commonplace, and that is that in our new book, we actually speak about the Great Reversal and not the Great Divergence. Because when you think divergence, you think about two areas that start at the same point and then one goes one way and the other goes the other way. That isn't exactly what happened. It's much more like a reversal. That is to say, when you look at the world, say, around the start of the second millennium, around 1000, then Europe is a barbaric, backward, illiterate, poor area, whereas China, and equally, I think, the Middle East, are rich, sophisticated, literate, way ahead of Europe in almost every dimension you want to think about it. And if you then move ahead 900 years and go to 1900, basically it's the other way around, right? Europe is miles ahead. They do whatever they want. They occupy, they plunder, they, gunboat, whatever it is. They essentially are the dominant civilization, and China and the Middle East are struggling. And so at some point, these trajectories crossed each other and the Europeans reversed the position. And so a lot of people ask that question, how did this happen? Why did this happen? When did it happen? And so on and so forth.
Well, to look at your explanation and your work around this, I thought one interesting place to start would be an epitaph to one of your books. I believe this was to the Enlightened Economy, which is from David Hume. And I won't quote it in full, but a section of it is that we cannot reasonably expect that a piece of woolen cloth will be wrought to perfection in a nation which is ignorant of astronomy. Why this section? What does it tell us? And where does it lead us?
I didn't expect that, but that's a really way they're putting it. But look, here it's like this, ever since human civilization started, people have been using tools and they have been using what I call techniques. And techniques are basically recipes, right? So basically you do this in order, if you want to have a piece of iron or bake a bread or, grow a cow, here are the things that you have to do. But for thousands of years, humans did things without having any kind of notion of why these things actually work. And if you don't know why things work, A, it's very difficult to improve them. And B, you don't actually know what does not work. And so a huge amount of mental energy has been dedicated over the years to do things that don't work. For instance, build a perpetuum mobile or make life infinitely long, create immortality and other such things. And as soon as you start understanding why things work and understand and get the underlying physics and the underlying chemistry and the underlying biology and whatever, it's much easier to improve them, and you don't waste time trying to do things that don't work. And so in that sense, I think economic development depends a great deal on the growing understanding of why things work. And maybe it is not a coincidence that the Industrial Revolution in Britain, that it got everything rolling, happened after the Scientific Revolution, but also during the Scientific Revolution, because the Scientific Revolution did not end with the death of Isaac Newton in 1727, but it continued on in a variety of fields. And, the great coda is perhaps the sort of invention of modern chemistry by Antoine Lavoisier in the last years of the Ancien Regime, and the huge advances made in physics, in biology in the 19th century. And so you never fully know why something works, right? You can always dig deeper and say, well, this is how it is, but why is it so? We don't know. But once you understand these laws, okay, and once you understand the regularities in natural phenomena, you can manipulate them and harness them to your own needs. And that's what we have basically done forever, but the acceleration in that process took place at some point after so-called the Middle Ages were over. I mean, the Middle Ages were over is a terrible expression. Historians will kill me for that because, the Middle Ages, of course, are a complete invention. Nobody during the Middle Ages knew that they were living in the Middle Ages. But somewhere around, I'd say, the printing press in the 1450s, and then the beginning of the Great Voyages a few decades later, and you start to sort of see a process by which people are trying to study the natural environment in a much more systematic and effective way. And they come up, and this is very important, with the tools to do so, okay? So in the 17th century, we see the development of telescopes, we see the development of microscopes, we see the development of vacuum pumps, and at the end of the century, mathematical tools, calculus, and so on and so forth. So people prepare the tools to study the nature, and with those tools, they developed their scientific understanding, including astronomy, which, had its uses even then.
I think that there are people who, when they hear this kind of science leads to technology, technology leads to economic progress, think that if we look at the modern, let's say last 100 years, 150 years, yeah, sure, you're not going to get the modern R&D lab without some science input. But unfortunately for your theory, they would say this is not what we see back in the days, in the earlier stages of industrialization. And I think that you had plenty of examples in your work of where there is this overlap. And I thought instead of going through them all, maybe one example that we could tease apart a little bit is the relationship between Joseph Black and James Watt, which of course relates to the most iconic machinery of the Industrial Revolution, the Watt steam engine. So what's the story of Joseph Black and James Watt? Who were they, and how does this relate to what you just said earlier?
Well, I think everybody basically knows who James Watt was. And it's also important to point out who he was not. He was not the inventor of the steam engine. I mean, a lot of people believe that. That's just not true. The first steam engine was put in place in 1712 in a place called Dudley Castle, and it was a steam engine using all the principles of the steam engine. And what Watt did was to essentially adapt it to industrial uses, because the first steam engines were so inefficient that it could only be used in coal mines to pump out the water. And what Watt eventually did in a variety of ways, and there were at least 4 major inventions he came up with, is to adapt it to manufacturing. And eventually others adapted it to transportation. They came up with railways and steamships and so on and so forth. Joseph Black was probably one of the best physicists in Europe at the time and came up with the theory of latent heat. And he was kind of a consultant to James Watt. They knew each other from Edinburgh, and they're both Scots. And there were two guys in Edinburgh. There was Joseph Black, and there was a man called John Robinson, who was his buddy. And they were among the leading physicists of their age, and Watt continuously consulted them. And in fact, the notion that inventors and industrialists and manufacturers should consult people of science actually ripened in the age of enlightenment. And this isn't just James Watt. There are other cases as well. Josiah Wedgwood famously wrote a letter to Antoine Lavoisier asking him something about some chemical issue he had with his pottery factory. We don't know if Lavoisier replied because that letter is either never written or lost. We don't know. But here's something worth pointing out, Hilary, and that is that even though Black was probably one of the premier scientists in Western Europe at the time, they actually had it wrong. They did not understand the principles that made a steam engine work. That was only first, developed in the middle of the 19th century by what we call today thermodynamics. Now, the earliest essay in thermodynamics was written in 1825 by a Frenchman called Sadi Carnot. But that was very difficult to understand, and it didn't really take off until the middle of the 19th century. So by 1860, we understand what makes a steam engine work. Before that, the theoretical basis of it was very poorly understood. And so it's been often argued, I think correctly, that the steam engine owed as much to science as science owed to the steam engine, because the fact that the steam engine worked stimulated a lot of scientists to figure out why and how it works. And so eventually people came up with thermodynamics, which we may not have had if it wasn't for the steam engine. So you don't really have a simple model in which science drives technology. It's more that they co-evolve and reinforce each other. And in fact, in my 2002 book, The Gift of Athena, I make a lot out of this. I basically say, look, you can have some kind of a positive feedback loop between people who make things and people who know things, so to speak. And as this feedback loop gets stronger and stronger, it will continue to reinforce each other, and the sky is the limit. And I think that's what we're living through today.
And so what would you say to the people who then point out to Black's lack of understanding and say that, well, it's very cute that these European scientists were consulting, but they didn't actually have any input, any real help, and therefore it's not really the right explanation?
Well, that's too strong. There were a few areas in which Black and Robinson gave some good advice, and those who want to see the details of it, you should consult the work of a historian of technology called Margaret Jacob, who has written about that very wisely. And she points out that not all the advice was bad, and to do with latent heat, and empirical regularities that they knew about and that actually work. And the idea of latent heat was actually utilized quite effectively by Watt, and then later on by people who worked on the high pressure steam engine. But also certain scientific insights that happened in the 17th century, particularly by a man called Evangelista Torricelli, who was a student of Galileo. And Torricelli was the first one to point out that the Earth is surrounded by an atmosphere, that we're living at the bottom of an ocean of air pressure. And if you don't understand that, then you'll never build a steam engine, right? Because the whole idea of a steam engine is the difference between the vacuum and the atmospheric pressure. So that was a major discovery. And then, he came up with the barometer, and then a whole bunch of other people like Blaise Pascal and so on and so forth experimented with it. And they were running up and down a mountain with this barometer showing how the air pressure went down as you went up higher and higher, and so on and so forth. So that's one important insight that we get from a scientist. And the other equally important is the fact that people showed, and this is mostly due to a German guy called Otto von Guericke, who was a burgomaster of the city of Magdeburg. And von Guericke was apparently the first one to build a vacuum machine and show that a vacuum is possible. Now, that seems sort of, again, banal to us. But remember, Aristotle said, nature abhors a vacuum. A vacuum is not possible. people say, well, it's possible. And they had these wonderful experiments which would drive everybody nuts today, which they put a cat inside a vessel and then sucked out all the air, creating a vacuum. And then they all watched the cat sort of slowly dying of suffocation. They were standing around there going, yeah. And I don't think that would be approved today by the 17th
no, the
century.
ethics
People
committees
had-
would not let that pass.
I know.
But I
But
think
the-
that it is an interesting point, and also maybe to change gears a little bit, I brought in black and white as the starting point, but of course there is a much more general process also, which is not just about some scientists giving ideas to one invention, which is the steam engine, but you also highlight the idea that often is for example called the Republic of Letters. This idea that a lot of Europeans are exchanging ideas, and then you also have the encyclopedia movement and the idea of cataloging, measuring, putting. I mean, the old the Diderot's encyclopedia, for example, it's full of like mechanical drawings and all this kind of, like people are really trying to figure out stuff, I guess would be one way of putting it. Do you think that that's even perhaps more important than the kind of scientific edge? Are they both equally important? How should we think about those two aspects?
So there's two things, and you're absolutely right pointing this out. And it's a very keen insight. There's sort of two things that you need to have if you're going to harness the forces of nature to your material needs. The first is you have to expand the set of knowledge, right? So you have to come up and one day say, well, here are my Newton laws or my, Galileo's laws or, whatever. Here is something that we discovered, and then you write a paper about it. You discover, I don't know, Harvey's circulation of the blood, these are all advances. But then you have to make them accessible. And so I spend a lot of time worrying about access because if, you can imagine a world in which one person discovers a major principle and doesn't tell anybody. Well, if you don't tell anybody, then it's not going to be any good. So the idea is that it has to be disseminated. And the notion of open science emerges with the Republic of Letters. That is to say, when you discover something, you don't keep it secret, but you actually publish it. Now, publication in those days was a bit different than it was today, but essentially you wrote letters to your friends and then they would copy your letter and send it to others, and that's basically that kind of networking is how the Republic of Letters worked. Of course, people who wrote all the books and pamphlets and so on and so forth, but you wanted the stuff to be put in the open. And that's still true today. If I come up with an idea, I'm not going to stick it in the drawer and keep it secret. I'm going to try to publish it. And in fact, the whole system, certainly the academic system, but other systems as well, are based on the fact that the more you publish and the more people, pay attention to you, the higher your prestige, the better your reputation, and all kind of good things come your way, including tenure at universities and all kind of other things, right? That is how we incentivize people not only to find new stuff, but then once they have found something, tell everybody. Now, this system is not very efficient because a lot of stuff that people publish is, of course, garbage or trivial. So the system is not perfect, but it works better than anything else. And I refer to this as sort of a market for ideas, right? So what happens is I come up with an idea and I write a paper and somebody reads the paper and says, yes, this is right. And I've made a sale. And that person had bought something, even though no money changes hands. And then the question is, how open is that market? How competitive is it? And, how effective is it? And so on and so forth. And it turns out that it's not very effective in the sense that a lot of stuff that is persuasive to a large number of people is garbage. So we're living in the United States today in the middle of a completely idiotic debate about the effectiveness of vaccination. That's just one example, right? And so it would seem that the evidence supports very strongly that vaccination works, but we now have a substantial minority of people who are really basically saying, no, vaccination is terrible. Now, you would hope that in the long run, that would not be the case, that, if there's something that is patently false, like the so-called scientific ideas of our current Secretary of Health and Human Welfare, that these will be driven out. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And there's a very big question whether modern communication technology is actually better at this, at driving out bad ideas than past technology. So when these encyclopedias that you're talking about, and there are many of them, and I discussed them at great length in various places, when these come out, I would say a considerable amount, a number of essays just have it wrong. There's all kind of sort of weird theories that now have been long discarded, like phlogiston and calorie and all kind of other things that were eventually refuted. So that market doesn't work very well. But it's all we have, Hilary. That's the problem.
Well, let's look east a little bit then to the question of China. If we focus on the Republic of Letters, on science, then we would have to ask, of course, the question of, well, why not there? Why not in China? And there are a couple of things I think you point out, for example, that I had never thought about before, but that one of the absolutely essential conditions for this Republic of Letters in Europe was a good postal system, which only emerges in Europe around 1500s due to various interesting details we don't need to go into now. But of course, in China, they also had a good postal system. In China, they had a long tradition of technology, etc., etc. So maybe the encyclopedia point can help us here. It's not that the Chinese did not write encyclopedias. Perhaps one of the most famous ones is Song Yingxing's Tiangong Kaiwu. I don't actually know. How is that translated to English?
I don't know.
Well, people can find it.
I'd have to look it up.
Written in the 1630s. It's something like...
under the late Ming.
Yeah, under the late Ming in the 1600s.
There was another one in the 14th century under the early Ming, and there was one in... I mean, they wrote encyclopedias, but these encyclopedias were not widely disseminated. And then remained basically the property of the emperor and his circle. And I think that is where one of the great differences is between China and Europe. Not the only one, but a very big, important one. And I pointed this out many years ago in 1990, and I still think I've got it right. And that is the Chinese were very good at science. They were very good at mathematics, different kind of mathematics, but they were good at it. But the problem is that almost all of the advances and all the dissemination happened within the Chinese imperial bureaucracy or the mandarinate. And almost all the major inventors that we know, we don't know all of them, but the major inventors in China were essentially bureaucrats. They worked for the emperor and they had to report to the emperor. And that worked actually quite well under the Song dynasty in particular. And then when you get the Yuan dynasty, where Marco Polo actually visited, so he told the Europeans all about it, this is still going on. But as the Ming and later on the Qing come to power, the emperors lose interest. And, so why they lost interest is probably has to do with the fact that they were trading off stability for progress. They said, we don't want progress, we're happy out today, but we want stability. And, new technologies sort of muddy the water and make waves, and we don't want that. In Europe, almost all scientific advances and technological advances were carried out by the private sector. The public sector, government, some kings and some emperors were patrons of science and technology, but basically they farmed it out to these guys and they let them do whatever they want, right? So you get somebody like Galileo, and he spent much of his life as a sort of court scientist at the court of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. But basically, they didn't tell him what to do, except toward the very end when he got into trouble with the Inquisition. But that's almost a side story. But for many years, he was doing whatever he wanted, and nobody told him what to do. He just got protection by the Grand Duke, and other kings and emperors did the same thing, largely because it was a matter of prestige. But it isn't that they were doing his will. And so any government that decided that they didn't like this stuff anymore, as happened in some places, basically all they would get is somebody would take his suitcases and go somewhere else. And of course, that happens a lot. That, I think, is a huge difference, because at some point, the Chinese emperors turn off the light switch, and they don't want it anymore. So, the famous example that people know is the famous Admiral Jing He, who did what the Europeans did, half a century later. They started to navigate, far away countries. But at some point, the emperor said, this is costing me too much money. And that was it. And eventually, they don't know how to make these huge ships anymore that Jing He used. And they don't really seem to care very much. Europeans keep pushing, but it's all done by private individuals. Sometimes sponsored by governments, but not more than that. And that makes a huge difference. And even today, if you think about it, in China, the role of the public sector in technological and scientific progress is much larger than in the West. Remember one thing, China has a well-functioning, sophisticated bureaucracy long before the Europeans had it. And in some ways, that may have been a disadvantage because the government was doing too much. Whereas in Europe, despite Louis XIV's famous declaration that he was the state, in fact, government is much less absolutist than in China, in large part because it's fragmented. And so if the government did something you didn't like, you picked up your suitcases and you left.
It's a very interesting point. Let me give you 3 different ways of reading this general trend. So the general trend is that in China, these big encyclopedias, they weren't selling particularly well, but they can also be banned. The Zheng He's voyages can first be funded, but then banned, etc., etc. There are 3 ways, I think, to read this. One of them you hinted at. The one is just that the Chinese state was able to do it because it was much bigger. And this is the classic idea which goes under terms like balkanization in Europe, that just the fact that the European map has a lot of these peninsulas and mountains and whatever, it leads into fragmentation, and that leads into the fact that no one has too much power. So that would be one reading. Theory 2 would be that it's not just that Europe was fragmented and therefore each monarch had less power, but because of the Enlightenment, partially, or whatever reasons, the Glorious Revolution in England being often a case in point, there is a reduction of the power of monarchy, especially in Britain. You actually have had a very good quote about this. You suggested that often the main enemy in history of economic success was some kind of bully somewhere. And then you say, quote, in the 17th century, British society became unusually good at restraining the greatest local bully of them all, namely the king, unquote. Theory 3 would be that the Chinese had different values. In some sense, they just weren't so interested. There's this great encyclopedia. Okay, the Europeans, for whatever reason, are like, okay, well, this is going to sell well. Let's print it out. And in China, it's not a sales hit. So it's not that they failed. They didn't actually want the same things in the first place. And so if you take these 3 theories, one is this kind of balkanization, diversity. You can pack your bags in Europe. Number 2, the restraining of the power of monarchy in Europe, especially in Britain. The number 3, the Chinese might just have different values. Are they all true equal? Is one of them more important than the other? How would you rate them?
In the end, I think what is driving all the other things is really values and preferences and beliefs. And that's why I called my book Cultural Growth, because these are all part of a big blob called culture. And I'll give you one, I think, fairly typical kind of difference between the two, which I made quite a lot of. And that is, how much respect do you have for the knowledge of previous generations? And when I started on this project many decades ago, one thing that I discovered is that the majority of human societies that ever were had an inordinate and probably undeserved respect for the knowledge of people who came before them. And they have some kind of inferiority complex about what they can do compared with the people who wrote the Talmud or the Quran or Confucius
or Aristotle in medieval Europe, absolutely.
Or Aristotle in medieval Europe. In Hebrew, we have a term called Yeridat Adorot, meaning the decline of generations. Basically mean we are inferior to those who came before us. And that's, I think, the ruling culture. And it's very strong in Islamic culture, particularly after Al-Ghazali in the 13th century. So you get that everywhere. At some point, Europeans, basically the only ones that ever do that, start losing that respect. And they become, shall we say, insolent, disrespectful toward the knowledge of previous generations, in part because they're discovering that a lot of the stuff is wrong. And this isn't just for Aristotle. So Aristotle was a major example, but it's Pliny and it's Ptolemy and it's all these guys, and basically say, look, we're smarter than they are. Once you have that, okay, you have a built-in concept of progress. By, I think, 1700, essentially, this sort of iron grip of the knowledge of the past is gone. People still read, Greek literature. They still admire Cicero, and they admire Aristotle's philosophy, and they admire, obviously, Euclid's geometry, but they can do better, and they know it. And, we have Newton, we had Galileo, we have Huygens, we have Leibniz, we can do it. And once you have that, okay, everything is different. And the Chinese really never picked that up. I mean, when they have, a reformation in their thinking, which is essentially what we call Neo-Confucianism, led by Jushi and people are in his circle, it is not that Confucius was wrong and that everything we learned is wrong. It's more we have to interpret this more carefully. And they debate what exactly was being meant, and you get all this sort of debate about precisely what is meant and what is not meant by in the text. And the Jews were also very good at it, trying to, analyze every word in the scriptures, but not coming up with novel things. And in that sense, the culture that Europeans developed after, I would say, roughly speaking, 1450. What's driving that is a whole bunch of things. The printing press is part of the story. So are the voyages, so are the new tools. But eventually, you get this sense of, hey, we're smarter than these guys are. And today, this is so true a fortiori. My wife, who is a biological scientist, basically says that by the time a paper is published, it's obsolete because you read it in draft form and then you pick up the idea and you run with it. Anything published 10 years ago, nobody even reads it. In economics, it's the same thing. 100 years ago, you couldn't get a medical degree if you hadn't studied the history of medicine. Today, they don't know anything about history of medicine. They wouldn't know Hippocrates from Galenus.
That description of European culture, I think, is actually quite easy to see this kind of change in viewpoint. And that's exactly what, I did my undergrad in philosophy, and the time that I was spending trying to understand kind of Enlightenment thought, the whole way that it was framed often when it started making sense was in this way of, no, don't listen to just what the past said, try for yourself. That resonates with me very well. I think it will resonate with a lot of listeners. But of course, there is a potential worry here that we are focusing on the positives, because many people here today would welcome that as a broadly positive trend. But of course, the rise of Europe during this time is not only entailed by positive cultural trends. For example, Kenneth Pomeranz, in his book, The Great Divergence, he focuses not only on fossil fuels, but also on colonies. He has his particular story about why the colonies matters, but probably anyone who we will talk about this topic will at some point ask, hold on, what about colonialism, imperialism, resource extraction, slavery, for example? And actually, so I started this conversation with the Hume epitaph, and I said that I'm not going to quote it in full. The full one would have actually ended that we cannot reasonably expect that a piece of woolen cloth will be wrought to perfection in a nation which is ignorant of astronomy or where ethics are neglected. Now, the role of ethics opens up a whole controversy around the ethics of the Enlightenment. I think there's a lot of naive criticism about Enlightenment, as if nasty things in Europe would not have existed before it, and as if this would not have been the time when, for example, the abolition becomes a movement. That said, Hume himself, he wrote very nasty things about non-Europeans, people of color. Voltaire was financially very entangled with the human trafficking across the Atlantic. And so there would be people who would say something like, sure, inventions are interesting, inventions are important, but why should we focus more on the invention of cotton spinning and not, for example, on the enslaved people producing that very cotton on colonial acres? So what do you think of that pushback?
It's not really a pushback. Nobody in his right mind would deny that these things happened, that they were bad, that they were unethical. I don't think that the Industrial Revolution or the Enlightenment or anything turns people into angels. There were nasty people then, there were nasty people today, there were nasty people in the Roman Empire and in ancient Greece and in ancient China. I mean, people do nasty things, and you could argue, and I wouldn't disagree that if you give them a stronger technology, the capability of doing nastier things is enhanced just as the capability of doing good things. Technology is always like that. Uh, Nobody has ever argued that the people who came up with the Enlightenment were nice or even democratic. Their whole ideas of democracy were very different from ours. That's not my argument, and I don't think really a lot of people still believe this sort of naive view of the Enlightenment. For me, what counted in the Enlightenment is the notion of a belief in progress, which suffuses the Enlightenment thinking. Now, progress for whom? Right? For people like David Hume, and in his own way, Adam Smith, and in his own way, Diderot and Turgot and Condorcet, all these people, they had a certain group in mind, which was not all of humanity. Okay, so some of them would include women, some of them don't, some of them would include people of their religion only. Jews wouldn't be counted. Others said no, Jews should be in there. People would argue about that. It remains a fact that one of the products of the Enlightenment, although it took a long time, was the abolitionist movement, and eventually slavery disappeared. It took a lot longer than we should have, certainly in certain areas. But these were not angels, and they weren't even necessarily nice guys, but they believed in certain kinds of progress. As an economist, I am particularly interested in material progress. And the fact of the matter is that the Enlightenment gave us a whole slew of things, and they solved a vast amount of technical, pragmatic, practical problems that improved life on Earth. And none of the people who are writing the history of capitalism and who are bringing in imperialism and colonialism and the slave trade, none of them would want to go back to the kind of life that people had in the 18th century, where life expectancy was 35 and where infant mortality rates were 200, 250 per thousand, in which people were constantly in pain, constantly itching, scratching, covered with insects, completely powerless against almost every disease imaginable, and in many cases, under constant threat of hunger and famine if the harvest failed. Now, by the 18th century, that no longer happens in the richest countries of Europe, but as you, as a Finn, should know, in 1868, Finland, which was not yet a developed country at the time, still suffered a terrible famine.
Yeah.
And so, that doesn't happen anymore, at least when it comes to natural factors. Now, unfortunately, in the 21st century, what nature cannot do anymore, we do to each other, which is what you see today in Sudan, you see it in Gaza, you see it in other places. So, I mean, in some sense, given the shortcomings of our society, who are we to judge the ethical principles of people, like Montesquieu? But that's not what I'm about. What I'm about is economic growth, economic development, and the measurable, undeniable improvement in the material conditions of people. And this is well known, not only that we live longer, that we don't expect our babies to die, but we are just on the whole healthier for a much longer time. We work less, far less than we worked in the past. We enjoy things that they wouldn't have dreamed about in the past, like, retirement for another 20 years after you're done working. I mean, I'm a bad example of that, but because I'm almost 80 and I'm still working. But most people aren't like me. And they retire at 60, 65, and they have another 20 years in which they go to museums and they play golf and they do God knows what. And so that kind of quality of life is something that in the past kings and emperors and popes wouldn't have dreamed about. The quality of our food, you just measure the protein carbohydrate ratio, which is a good measure of, how well you're eating, right? I mean, in that sense, the lives have improved enormously. One of the things that strikes me when I go to Europe, it's less true in America, but is you almost see no poverty. I mean, the New Testament says the poor will always be with you. Well, they haven't been to Zurich lately.
And I think what's also ironic, perhaps worth noting, is that not only material factors, but of course, if you're right, that the very idea of progress comes from this era. It is, of course, ironic that the harshest critics of that era tend to be called people who call themselves progressives. But leaving that aside, there's so much that we could go deeper into here. But let's start coming to a close. I have short questions for you before we finish. The first one is summarizing everything that we have discussed in only 1 minute. How do you explain the Great Divergence?
There isn't a single explanation. But the new book that we have written, hang on for a second, let me pull it off the shelf and show it to you in a shameless self-promotion. So there you have it. So this is joint. Hang on. So this is joined with two friends. One of them is a student of mine, Abner Greif, and the other is Guido Tambellini of Bocconi University. So this book is called Two Paths to Prosperity, and it's about the great divergence or the great reversal. And basically what it argues is that in addition to the sort of standard stories that are told by people like Ken Pomeranz and a whole sort of long list of scholars about this who've been talking about, but this book takes a different approach, and it claims that one of the big differences that explain the difference between Europe and China is that in China, after 1000, large extended families, or what we call clans, become more and more important, whereas in Europe, it's the other way around. And they have more and more focusing on nuclear families. And once you have a world of nuclear families, you have to create organizations that provide, local services. So we get guilds and we have monasteries and we have autonomous cities. And you don't see any of that in China, or very little of it. And that made a huge difference. Now, the full story of there is, 450 pages long or thereabout. So I can't summarize it in 1 minute, but the basic idea is that what we have left out is what we call, social organizations. And so that's another element to put, and we'll see how the profession sees that. But here it is.
What about for people who are also working in this area? What would be like an underrated angle or a very promising, lesser thought of angle to the Great Divergence that you would like more research on personally?
What I am particularly curious about, and I hope to live long enough to see it, is that whether the Chinese model of advancing what I call useful knowledge, so science and technology, whether that will continue to work in a society that's fundamentally unfree and undemocratic. So we've had one experiment like that in the 20th century, which was the Soviet Union. There we know the answer, okay, which is that failed miserably. Does that mean that China will fail too? And the answer is, I don't know. Xi Jinping isn't like Stalin, and they don't have any Lyashenkos there, as far as I know, so to date. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But if it works for them, and China will surpass the US in terms of its technological leadership, as they seem to be trying very hard, whether perhaps we don't need many of the political institutions that we owe to enlightenment, as long as we keep the idea of progress going, which the Chinese now have adopted wholesale, and they're working, developing things. You just look at the difference in their policies vis-a-vis climate change compared to the miserable performance of the United States. And you get an idea that they have a much stronger idea of progress than we do. And so it's possible that their system will work. And I find that fascinating. And I want to live to be 140 to be able to write another book saying whether this worked or not. But that's not terribly likely.
So my next question was going to be, will we live through a great convergence?
Well, we'll see. The world is always going to be unequal in some ways. Some areas will have an advantage on other. On the other hand, what you should keep in mind that in our own age, when something is invented somewhere, it is invented everywhere, because knowledge spreads at a blinding speed. In the Middle Ages, it would take 100 years or more. It took 400 years for paper, which was invented in China, to make it through Central Asia, through the Islamic world, finally to arrive in Italy, okay? Now, any advances in material science or in anything else, you put it on the internet, you publish it, it's available everywhere. And so that means we're living in a very different world. Whether people will be able to take advantage of the new knowledge remains to be seen.
Okay, my final question is, how has all your work shaped your outlook on our future?
Well, it's not just my work. I'm a citizen. I read the newspapers. I follow the news obsessively, I would think. It's probably a good way of saying it. My wife and I spend a great deal of time watching the news, reading newspapers, things like that. We're very keen on what's happening, not just in the US, but worldwide. And some of the optimism that I had, say, in 1990 has subsided, given that in many of the countries where we thought there's going to be a move towards freedom and democracy and more liberal future seem to have subsided, and instead the world seems to be moving towards some kind of a benighted form of populism that we see today in the United States, but also threatening in many other countries in Europe, which I thought going to remain bastions of openness and freedom. And so my daughter wrote me an email a month ago asking me, if you want to leave the United States, what's a country that would be safe? And after some thought, I wrote back, maybe Iceland. I mean, you live in Britain, so you know the threat of, Nigel Farage and his companions. We already have these people in power, and so does Turkey, so does Slovakia. I mean, it is upon us. So my optimism isn't particularly strong as far as politics is concerned. On the other hand, I am perfectly convinced that from a purely technological point of view, progress will accelerate because it's not that we're getting smarter. We're not any brighter, but we have better tools. That's what counts. And AI is just the latest incarnation of these tools. It's an incredibly powerful tool, but compared to what we had before, the computer was just as discontinuous and discrete a jump as AI is, and God knows what comes after that.
Professor Joel Mokyr, thank you so much for your time today, and congratulations on a very well-deserved Nobel Prize.
Thank you. This was great fun, Larry.
Okay, so that was it for today. Thank you for joining us. This episode was part of the Great Divergence series produced by Warwick University's Cage Research Center in collaboration with On Humans. You'll find each of these episodes on both the Cage Economic History podcast and the On Humans podcast. If you enjoy this, do check out also our series page, which includes a summarized essay of this conversation with more links and a bibliography. And do subscribe to the shows to be tuned for our future episodes, including next week's one, when we hear about a theory that is often presented as the alternative, the competitor to Joel Mokyr's. A theory very much associated with our guest next week, our guest being Robert Allen.